Hi folks, welcome back to the Small Business Toolbox, where we talk about the nuts and bolts of self-employment in the UK. I'm Andy Mack and I've been self-employed for a long time, and I'm just hoping that some of the things that I've learned over the years can benefit you in some way. Last time we had a little chat about invoicing and actually getting paid by your customers. Today we're going to chat about a different type of invoice, and that's called a pro forma invoice. A regular invoice is generally used to get paid for work that you've already done. But what if you want to get paid in advance for some work? Well, that's where the pro forma invoice comes into play. As we briefly touched on last time, a regular invoice fulfills two different roles. It's a tax document and it's a legal document. A pro forma doesn't work like that. It's not a tax document, it's of no use whatsoever for your accounts or the accounts of the person that you give it to, and it's also only loosely a legal document. It kind of depends on terms and conditions that you might enforce onto your pro forma, but generally speaking, your pro forma is not going to carry the same weight as an actual invoice. In many ways, a pro forma invoice is actually closer to a quote than an invoice. So as per usual, you can download a template pro forma invoice off my Patreon. There's a link in the description below, or you can generate your own. They're relatively easy to make. Let me talk you through one and explain the sort of information that you might want to include in a pro forma invoice. One of the key things to remember with a pro forma is that there's really no right and wrong. There's no official guide or official way that a pro forma invoice should look. This is just what I've seen over the years, and based on what companies have given to me for invoices and to my companies for invoices. Everyone does it slightly differently. And really all I would say is this is a starting point for your business. And I would say check with your accountant, maybe check with your solicitor if you've got one, and check that they're happy with the way that you're doing things. It's really up to you to do your own homework that this is going to be suitable for your business. But as I say, if you want to download this particular Excel template for a pro forma, it's on my Patreon and you can get access to it from there. And it just gives you a starting point. Over the years, I've seen some companies that literally generate a quote, and then all they do is they change the wording at the top. Instead of saying quote, they change it to pro forma. I've seen some companies that generate an invoice and just change it from invoice to pro forma at the top. And I've seen some that do it in more of a kind of halfway house between a quote and an invoice, which is more what this is. If you disagree with anything I'm saying in this, please pop it down in the comments below, because as I say, there's a number of schools of thought on how this should be done. Let me take you through every section and kind of explain what's going on here. So firstly, and most importantly, we're saying at the top here that it's a pro forma invoice. And any accounts department that you're going to be dealing with, they're going to know straight away what that means. If you're dealing mostly B2B, business to business, you might find that if you want to be paid in advance for something, that company insists on getting a pro forma invoice. They might not pay you in advance for products or services if you give them a normal invoice, because they might turn around and say, well, we haven't received the goods yet, so you can't give us a normal invoice. Please can you issue a pro forma? That's a prime example of where you would issue a pro forma, is if the customer you're dealing with insists on getting one. Remember, the whole objective here is to get paid before you've done anything. So we're saying on the invoice, pro forma invoice. And as briefly mentioned, one of the key differences with a pro forma is that this can't be used for tax purposes. It can't be used to reclaim VAT if you charge VAT. So on a pro forma, you should absolutely put on that this is not a tax invoice or this is not a VAT invoice. I prefer to put this is not a tax invoice, because even if you're not VAT registered, for your own accounting records and for the accounting records of the company that you're dealing with, they need to know that they can't use this invoice for their own tax purposes, like whether it's corporation tax or self-assessment tax. You can't use a pro forma as part of your log of receipts and all that sort of thing. So say, for example, you've bought something off a company and they give you a pro forma invoice. You can't include that as part of your receipts. You need to get a proper receipt or a normal invoice to use that as part of your accounting records. A pro forma is no use, because by the very nature of a pro forma, nothing's happened yet. At the point that this is issued, no one's bought anything, no one's received anything, and no money has changed hands. So over on the right here, we've got date issued. I think it's a good idea to put a date on it so that they've got a record of when they received it. Now, the order reference, this is an interesting one, and again, this is something to do your own research on. I have read stuff that says that you shouldn't put an invoice reference or a reference number of any description on a pro forma. But to me, that would just be the most impractical thing in the world. You need to be able to cross-reference this back to the order. Most companies that I've dealt with use the invoice number as the reference number on the pro forma, because normally they'll turn the pro forma into an invoice once the goods have been delivered. It's up to you what reference number you use, but I've just shown an order ref in the same format as I explained on the invoices video last time. So do your own homework on whether or not you want to use a reference number on a pro forma. Obviously, we've got the customer's full contact details, so name and address and all that sort of thing. And then into the main body of the pro forma invoice, pretty much same as a normal invoice really, except we're making it clear that it's prepayment in advance for whatever you're providing. Give a bit of detail of obviously what they're paying for. If this is for a substantial amount of money, you know, you might be selling 50 grand's worth of computer equipment to a company and you need to get paid in advance or whatever, then just make sure that there's sufficient detail in there that you will get paid. If in doubt, speak to the company that you're dealing with and ask what they want included on the invoice to make sure that it's paid promptly. So I don't need to go into that, fairly self-explanatory. And then down the bottom of the pro forma, obviously we've got the grand total amount due. As I say, I'm not VAT registered, and I'm assuming you're not VAT registered. If you are, then you would need to include VAT at the bottom there. So you would include a breakdown of the VAT and the grand total amount. So you would probably change that to just subtotal and put grand total at the bottom there. Bear in mind that the company can't use this pro forma to reclaim their VAT. So they will expect to receive a proper VAT invoice. This is not a VAT invoice, can't be used to reclaim VAT by the company that you're dealing with. They will expect to receive a proper VAT invoice as soon as the goods and services have been fulfilled. So just bear that in mind. But they will have to pay you the grand total, including the VAT. If that turns into a problem, because a lot of businesses will say, well, I'm not paying you the VAT because I can't reclaim it using this pro forma invoice, in which case have a chat with them and maybe just issue a normal invoice instead. If that's going to be a stumbling block, maybe don't use a pro forma and just stick to a bog standard invoice that they can reclaim the VAT on as usual. But I'm assuming for the purposes of this that you're not VAT registered anyway. And as such, you should mention that on the invoice, no VAT to pay, so that they know they don't need to expect a VAT invoice and they can't reclaim any VAT anyway. Now, this is something that I often see missed out of pro formas, and I would give it some thought. And I would put a line on just saying how long the pro forma is valid for. Because you might be providing goods or services where the price fluctuates. Say, for example, it's computer equipment or something like that. You might have issued a pro forma for 25 grand's worth of gear, but then they don't pay you for 30 days, and by the time they've paid you, that stuff might have gone up to 35 grand's worth of gear. You know, it might have fluctuated, and that might cause a problem. So I would tell the customer how long this price is valid for, just so you don't get into that situation where they drag their heels on paying you and then the price isn't valid anymore. E&OE, I explained that last time. Go and check the invoice video that I made. Terms and conditions, this is a bit of a funny one because your terms and conditions probably aren't going to reference pro formas. Remember, a pro forma isn't a legally binding document, technically. But you might want to include stuff in your terms and conditions that refers to how pro forma invoices work. Again, it depends on your own individual business model, but there's no real harm in including a link to your terms and conditions. It's just your terms and conditions might not be relevant to a pro forma invoice. Obviously, you need to include how to get paid. This is probably the most important bit, because the whole point of a pro forma is to get paid in advance for product or services. So you need to tell them how to pay you. If needs be, put this in bold and in big letters in the body of the invoice, so there's no doubt on payment methods that you accept and your bank details if they're going to be doing a bank transfer. And then obviously as well, you need to include your own business details, your business name, business address, postcode, contact details, just everything to make it easy for the company that you're dealing with to pay you. Because if they're missing any of that information and they're running accountancy software, they'll not be able to enter you on their system as a payee without having key information such as that. So it's normally because of stuff that ends up getting left off invoices and pro forma invoices that results in delayed payment. So don't give them any excuse to delay paying you. So remember, as soon as you've been paid and you know that it's cleared payment into your bank account, watch out for scams, by the way, where they pretend that they've paid you and they haven't actually paid you. I've seen that a few times before. Make sure if it's an unknown entity that you're dealing with that you've definitely got cleared payment in your bank account before you send any goods out to customers. Businesses get stung in non-payment scams all the time, so be really careful. If it looks too good to be true and someone's putting an order in for an unusual amount of equipment and you've never heard of that company and it looks slightly suspicious, really do your homework on that, because I've seen so many scams where a significant quantity of goods have been sent out to bogus companies through them pretending to pay you in advance, and then it's been like a bounced check or it's been some other money transfer scam or whatever. So do be really careful. If it looks too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true. In my experience, if a company gets in touch with you wanting to order a massive amount of equipment and you've never heard of them and you've never dealt with them before and they seem eager to pay you really quickly and just receive the goods, in my experience, 9 out of 10 times that's been a scam. I'm not saying don't deal with them, just be very careful. I'll tell you some stories about that on a different video. But assuming that you are dealing with a legitimate company, just make sure that you get the proper invoice sent out to them as quickly as possible, especially if you're VAT registered, because they're going to want to reclaim the VAT and they can't do that until you've sent out a proper normal invoice. So once it's been paid, once you've sent the goods out, get a normal invoice issued and you can put on it paid and when it was paid. Remember as well that both yourself and the customer that you're dealing with, you need to both be aware of when the tax point is for transactions like this. The tax point's a really important thing to get your head around, because it's kind of setting a date in stone of where this ends up on the financial records for yourself and the financial records of the company that you're dealing with. This is something to check with your accountant, but normally if you're charging in advance for goods or services, the tax point date is going to be the date that you received the payment. So in that sort of situation, you could end up having to generate an invoice that has two different dates on it. You could end up with an invoice date, in other words, the date that you sent the invoice out, and a tax point date, which might be 2 weeks before that, depending on when they paid you. So just bear that in mind. If you do a lot of work with payments up front, especially B2B, then check with your accountant on the best way that it needs to work for your business. And remember as well, if you do charge VAT, there are some extra rules that you need to bear in mind in terms of the invoice date and the tax point date and things like VAT cash accounting and stuff like that. You need to take all that into the equation, and that's where an accountant is going to be worth their weight in gold. This is just intended as a starting point and to kind of explain the basics of a pro forma to you. And it's worth mentioning as well, if you do mainly deal B2C, so business to consumer, then they probably don't care whether they get a normal invoice or a pro forma invoice. Just bear that in mind. But if you issue a normal invoice to a customer, and this applies whether it's B2B or B2C, and then they don't pay it, and they don't go ahead with the order, then you're going to have to issue a credit note to cancel out the invoice that you've raised, and we'll cover that on a future video. But just bear that in mind. So if they're a bit of an unknown, you're not sure whether they're going to pay or not, then a pro forma might be a better route to go down, because if they don't pay, there's been no exchange of goods or services anyway, and basically nothing happens until they've actually coughed up. But if you do go down the normal invoice route and they don't pay, you're going to have to balance that out on your accounts somehow, normally with a credit note. In my personal experience, I prefer to use a normal invoice 99% of the time. And really, there's only two scenarios where I would use a pro forma. And that is brand new customers who you're not sure if they're going to pay you for the goods or services and you don't want to take that risk on putting them onto a credit account. And established companies who refuse to pay you in advance unless you give them a pro forma invoice. So if it's a company specifically asking for a pro forma, do a pro forma. Other than that, I would normally just do a normal invoice, but bearing in mind that if a normal invoice doesn't get paid, as I just mentioned, you're going to have to go through cancelling the invoice in some sort of way, issuing a credit note to balance your accounts back out and all that sort of thing. You need to do your own homework on when you think you need to do a pro forma instead of a normal invoice. If you've got any questions or comments, pop them below. We're going to be covering off a few other invoice related topics in future videos, including credit notes and receipts. So if there's anything else that you want me to cover, then please let me know. For now, absolute best of luck with your business, and I shall see you next time. Bye!